Things happened rather quickly in the next 2 weeks. Susan decided to tell her mother, but not Hetta. She spoke to her mother that afternoon. "And what did you say to him, Susan?" "Nothing, mother, not a word. He told me he didn't want it." She forgot how she had used his first name in asking God to keep him. "Oh, dear," said her mother. "Was it very wrong?" asked Susan. "But what do you think yourself, my child?" asked Mrs. Bell after a time. "What are your own feelings?" Mrs. Bell was sitting on a chair, and Susan was standing opposite her. She made no answer, but, moving from her place, she threw herself into her mother's arms and hid her face on her mother's shoulder. It was easy enough to guess what her feelings were. "But, my dear," said her mother, "you must not think that you are promised in marriage." "No," said Susan sorrowfully. "Young men say these things to amuse themselves." "Oh, mother, he is not like that." The daughter managed to get a promise that Hetta should not be told just at present. Mrs. Bell calculated that she had 6 weeks before her. Mr. Beckard had not asked Hetta to marry him yet, but there was reason to think that he would do so before those 6 weeks were over, and then she would be able to ask him for advice. Mr. Beckard spoke out at the end of 6 days, and Hetta immediately accepted him. "I hope you'll love him," she said to Susan. "Oh, I will," said Susan, and she nearly told her secret. But Hetta was thinking of her own affairs. It was then arranged that Hetta should go and spend a week with Mr. Beckard's parents. Old Mr. Beckard was a farmer living near Utah, and it was thought a good idea that Hetta should know her future husband's family. So she went for a week, and Mr. Beckard went with her. "He will be back in plenty of time for me to speak to him before Aaron Dunn's 6 weeks are over," said Mrs. Bell to herself. But things did not go exactly as she had expected. On the morning after the two went away, there came a letter from Aaron saying that he would be at Saratoga that evening. The railway people had ordered him to come back for some days' special work. Then he would go away again and not come back to Saratoga until June. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bell to herself, thinking that she had no one to advise her. Why had she let Mr. Beckard go without telling him? Then she told Susan, and Susan spent the day trembling. Perhaps, thought Mrs. Bell, he will say nothing about it. But then, would it not be her duty to say something? Poor mother, she trembled nearly as much as Susan. It was dark when the knock came at the door. The tea-things were laid, and the tea-cake was ready. Since it would be necessary in any case to give Mr. Dunn his tea, Susan, when she heard the knock, rushed upstairs. Kate O'Brien opened the door and welcomed her old friend. "How are the ladies?" asked Aaron, trying to learn something from the servant's face and voice. "Miss Hetta and Mr. Beckard have gone off to Utah, just like man and wife." "Oh, really? I'm very glad," said Aaron. And so he was, very glad to have Hetta away. And then he went to the sitting-room, doubting much and hoping much. Mrs. Bell rose from her chair and tried to look serious. Aaron saw that Susan was not in the room. He walked straight up to the woman and offered her his hand, which she took. Perhaps Susan had not told, so he said nothing. But the subject was too important to the mother to allow her to be silent when the young man stood before her. "Oh, Mr. Dunn," she said, "what is this that you have been saying to Susan?" "I have asked her to be my wife," said he, standing up straight and looking her full in the face. Mrs. Bell's heart was almost as soft as her daughter's, but at the time she said only, "Oh dear, oh dear." "May I not call you mother?" said he, taking both her hands in his. "Oh dear, but will you be good to her? Oh, Aaron Dunn, if you deceive my child." In another quarter of an hour, Susan was kneeling at her mother's knee, with tears in her eyes, and Aaron was holding one of her mother's hands. "You are my mother too now," said he. What would Hetta and Mr. Beckard say when they came back? There were 4 or 5 days left before they would come back, 4 or 5 days during which Susan might be happy, Aaron glad, and Mrs. Bell nervous. But it was really only the evenings that were left of the days. Every morning Susan got up to give Aaron his breakfast, but Mrs. Bell got up too. After that, Aaron was always out until 7 or 8 in the evening, when he came home for his tea. Then came the hour or two of lovers' meeting. But they were very dull, those hours. The mother was still afraid that she was wrong, and although she wanted her daughter to be happy, she feared to be too sure. Not a word had been said about money matters, not a word of Aaron Dunn's relations, so she did not leave the young people by themselves, but waited patiently for her wise advisers to come back. And Susan hardly knew how to behave with Aaron. She felt that she was very happy, but perhaps she was happiest when she was thinking about him through the long day, arranging little things for his comfort and waiting for the evening. And as he sat there in the sitting-room, she could be happy too, if she were only allowed to sit still and look at him. But he wanted to hear her speak, and perhaps thought he had the right to sit by her and hold her hand. No such rights were given to him. If they had been alone together, walking side by side as lovers ought to walk, she could have spoken to him. But though there was much love between Aaron and Susan, they were not close friends yet, and her mother's presence prevented easy conversation. Aaron was very fond of Mrs. Bell, but he did sometimes wish that her housework would take her out of the sitting-room for a few happy minutes. Once, for a moment, he did find his love alone when he returned to the house. "My own Susan, do you love me? Do say so to me once." And he managed to put his arm round her. "Yes," she whispered, but then she slipped away from him. And when she reached her room, she felt that she really did love him deeply, with a love that filled her whole life. Why could she not have told him something of all this? And so the few days of his second stay at Saratoga passed away not very satisfactorily. It was arranged that he should return to New York on Saturday night, leaving Saratoga on that evening. And as Hetta and Mr. Beckard were arriving back to dinner on that day, Mrs. Bell would have an opportunity of telling her wonderful news. It might be a good thing for Mr. Beckard to see Aaron before he left. They came in time for dinner and talked about all their arrangements. After dinner, Susan disappeared immediately, and her mother told Hetta. "Asked her to marry him?" said Hetta, who perhaps thought that one marriage in a family was enough at one time. "Yes, my dear, and he did it, I must say, in a very honourable way, telling her not to make any answer until she had spoken to me. That was very nice, was it not, Phineas?" "And what has been said to him since then?" asked Phineas. "Nothing definite," said Mrs. Bell. "I know nothing about his financial affairs." "He is a man who will always earn his bread," said Mr. Beckard, and Mrs. Bell blessed him in her heart for saying it. "But has he been encouraged?" asked Hetta. "Well, yes, he has," said her mother. "Then Susan, I suppose, likes him?" asked Phineas. "Well, yes, she does," said the woman. It was decided that Phineas should have a talk with Aaron about his worldly position, and decide whether Aaron could be accepted as a lover. When Beckard spoke to Aaron, the latter declared that he had nothing except what he made as an engineer. He said that he was well paid just then, but would have to look for other work at the end of the summer. "Then you can hardly marry at present," said the minister. "Perhaps not quite immediately. In 3 or 4 months, perhaps." But Mr. Beckard shook his head. The afternoon at Mrs. Bell's house was sad. The decision was as follows. There could be no promise, and of course no letters. Aaron would be told that it would be better for him to stay somewhere else when he returned, but that he would be allowed to visit Mrs. Bell's house, if he got better and more permanent work, of course, and if Susan still felt the same. This was what Mrs. Bell and Hetta told Susan. She sat still and cried when she heard it, but she was not surprised. She had always felt that Hetta would be against her. "Am I not allowed to see him, then?" she said through her tears. Hetta thought she had better not. Mrs. Bell thought perhaps she could. Phineas decided that they could shake hands when all the others were present. There should be no lovers' goodbye. Poor Susan. Susan was gentle and womanly, but Aaron was not very gentle, and he was a man. When Mr. Beckard told him of the decision, there came over his face the look which he had worn when he burned the picture. He said that Mrs. Bell had encouraged him, and he did not understand why other people should now come and change things. "It was not a promise," said Mrs. Bell sorrowfully. "He said that he was ready and able to work and knew his profession, and asked what young man of his age had done better than he had."